Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to J Raids and welcome to another Raid Shadow Legends video. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day and thank you guys for joining me today here on the next edition of the PvP Meta Snapshot. Although I should probably rename it or something like that because it's more so of just a, well, it's less of a snapshot now, but anyways, today's topic that I want to cover is how to deal with lockout champions. Of course, Fabian is probably the one that people see the most often in the meta, and this sort of cooldown increasing effect is everywhere. It is probably the most consistent and most powerful ability slash effect that you can have within PvP and can be a fairly certain way to secure a victory if your opponent does not have proper ways of dealing with lockout. Let's just see, for example, if I hop into arena here. Now, I'm in Platinum Arena, high-end Platinum Arena. Fabian is still going to be very popular, but you'll see a lot more champions or a lot more people running Krixia instead, which is almost a direct upgrade, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just to give you an idea of how prevalent lockout champions are, for example, and I'm sure you guys will see this down in other ranks of arena as well, although I'm sure less and less as the further you go down. But if you guys are participating in live arena, I'm sure again you guys are very familiar how popular of a champion Fabian is in order to be picked. But let's go through the list for now. So we have Krixia, Fabian, Krixia, Fabian. None here, surprisingly, but actually one of the alternative methods that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then Yumeko, which is perfect for this sort of void affinity with Odin. And if we do a refresh real quick, we'll see Krixia. Geralt has a cooldown increase, but we'll count that as a no. Krixia. So 9 out of 10 arena defenses have some sort of lockout in them, and of course when you're trying to use your arena attacks as well, having a consistent source of lockout is also a very consistent way of beating your opponents. But with lockout champions so prevalent, how exactly do we deal with them? And honestly, there's really not that many champions that kind of fit in this role. Of course, Fabian and Krixia being the two most popular ones. Yumeko, probably the third most popular. And then Warlord, I think, was sort of a vestige of the past. You don't really see him that often anyway, but he has really low base speed, so it's hard to make him work. But even though it is 2.5 champions, I'm going to count Yumeko as a half champion, not because she's bad, but just because of how much less visible she is within the arena meta. And it really comes down to just these two champions plus Yumeko that are kind of acting as this whole boogeyman in terms of the arena. If you don't have either of them, you're kind of out of luck in terms of trying to compete in this aspect. But I'm going to introduce to you guys a couple of strategies that you can do that don't involve just having a faster lockout champion. So I have 5 strategies that I've outlined here that I think are quite effective at helping you to deal with lockout. And so the 5 of them are: 1, having a cooldown refresh champion; 2, bring champions that care a lot less about being locked out; 3, having a high resistance support or a very tanky support that can help keep your team alive; 4, taking out the lockout champion first before they get to have a turn; and then 5, just having like a really fast go first strategy. Now, on to the first one, and just a quick notice, I did rank these, in my opinion, what I think are the most effective going down. So 1 is the most effective, and then 4 is the least effective, and then 5, we'll talk about 5 a little bit later. What I haven't included on here is option 0, which is simply to just have a faster lockout champion. If your Fabian is, let's see how fast my Fabian is, and you guys can tell me in the comments if you guys would have won this little speed race. But my Fabian, he's not very fast. He's only about 405 speed. I have some clanmates with like 450 speed Fabians with more accuracy than me, and it's ridiculous. But I have a 405 speed Fabian. I do have a 6-star intimidating presence, so you can add on whatever little bit of speed you want to consider there. But obviously, if I have a 405 speed Fabian and you have a 406 speed Fabian, well, all of a sudden, my Fabian's kind of rendered useless, right? So obviously, option 0 is if you guys are in a mirror matchup or you both sides have a lockout champion, the simplest way of dealing with it is just to have a faster lockout champion. Now, of course, that's not always possible, and there's always going to be somebody faster than you. So we're going to try to talk about some strategies that don't rely on this. But just keep that in mind. If you can just have a faster lockout champion, that's going to help set you up for the arena meta. But let's talk about cooldown refresh. Now, cooldown refresh is a super powerful ability, having this way of being able to just like to bring up your cooldowns. And again, as much as there are limited cooldown increased champions, there are a relatively limited pool of champions that do have this ability to have some sort of cooldown refresh. The first one that comes to mind is, of course, is Krixia, which is one of the main reasons why she is such a staple in terms of high-end arena. Being built as a fast speed lockout champion, but if you are slower, you still have that ability to swap into the second form with Krixia. And then she does have this Night Purge ability, which helps to decrease the cooldown of all ally skills by 3 turns. So that's why like Krixia is so powerful. She has both sides of the coin. She can increase cooldowns, and if she's slower, she can then just simply decrease the cooldowns of your allies. Now, I think, of course, Krixia is a mythical champion, and that's not something that most people are going to have. But another option that I think is super good, and probably, I would say, in my opinion, a little bit underrated, is Donatello. He was, of course, a limited time champion, but he was made available to all players via the fusion system. And so, of course, if you guys completed the Fabian fusion, hopefully you guys stuck around and completed Donatello fusion as well. And he is a super potent asset to Arena. And what makes him so good is, again, in the similar veins, he has the Shell Shocker ability here, which can decrease the cooldown of all ally skills by 2 turns. And he has increased speed on this ability, and the rest of his kit is still very phenomenal as well. He has this full cleanse with strengthen and continuous heal and a turn meter boost. He has a heal on his A1, and he has this very incredible passive, which is kind of like a who's the Freya. It's very similar to a Freya passive, but is a lot less conditional, but also doesn't give the extra turn, right? So anytime an ally is about to receive a fatal hit, it's going to prevent that damage and just have an HP balance, right? So super powerful support champion in the arena. And let's see, I know we peeked into the arena and we saw one Donatello in the last refresh. Looks like there isn't any here, but if let's take a look at the top players and see if you can fish out a Donatello or two. Yeah, so like over here, right, this guy has the Donatello in his squad. This is the guy we peeked earlier, but very powerful way to not only bring in a cooldown refresh, but also to have an extra bit of survivability for anyone caught off guard. Now, looking back at the rest of our options, we have champions like Yumeko. Again, Yumeko is kind of this interesting champion, sort of like Krixia, where she has both an increased cooldown as well as a cooldown refresh ability on the same effect on the same ability. I'll just quickly pull up Krixia right now. Again, she is a Void legendary champion, of course, and so her Dance of Time has this ability to do both, but she is impervious to being locked out herself as well. Same as Donatello, right? Kaimar, I think, is just another straggler example here. But one of the cool things is, even though they are able to be locked out, you can still pair them with something like a Chronophage set. For example, one of the newer sets released to the game, honestly, it got a pretty bit of a bad buzz in terms of like, this isn't a set you should worry about farming for. But I think I'm a little bit sad that I don't actually have a good set of Chronophage. Because at 4 stacks, you get the buff that's immutable, which blocks and attempt to increase skill cooldowns on this champion. So if you are able to put your champion like your Donatello, your Yumeko, your Kaimar in a chronophage set, you have that sort of insurance against being locked out. And then when you have a turn, you can go in and increase the or decrease the cooldowns on your allies' abilities so you can get yourself back in the fight. There is a little bit of a caveat to this where Krixia, because Krixia is just so powerful, she first removes all buffs and then increases the cooldowns of enemy skills, which means that something like Chronophage can be removed first and then can be put on cooldown. So this is something you have to be a little bit careful about. If you do want to put Chronophage onto your champions, you do want to back it up with Lightning Cage in order to protect it from champions like Krixia. I think another interesting thing to note right now is both Donatello as well as Kaimar. Kaimar is kind of like a who invited this guy to the team, but we'll use him as an example for now. I'll just say Donatello. Both Krixia as well as Fabian are both Spirit Affinity champions. Now, what is cool about Donatello is he is a magic affinity champion, which means that he has strong affinity towards both Fabian as well as Krixia, which also means there is a chance of weak hit. And if Donatello is weak hit by a Krixia or a Fabian when they try to do the lockout, it's not going to actually land, right? So I think that's also another factor that just makes Donatello really good, because if you go back to, what are the 2.5 lockout champions that are really in the meta, we have 2 spirit champions and a void champion, right? The void champion, tough luck, doesn't even hit you, can't even weak hit. But when it comes to Fabian and Krixia, they are both Spirit Affinity champions, and somehow both Kaimar as well as Donatello are magic-based champions. So they are strong affinity, have a chance to weak hit, which makes them even more powerful. And of course, you can build them in high resistance as well, and so you resist the cooldown increase rather than wanting to put on a Chronophage, for example. Now, of course, the last one I want to mention is Glissea. I did talk about her in my last meta report, but she is just an interesting champion herself, where she also has this pseudo sort of lockout prevention. She is a Sacred Order champion over here, so Glissea. So she has this pseudo sort of lockout prevention where she has a 50-50 chance of preventing the lockout from happening, as well as the freeze, which would stop the lockout in its place. So as much as there are a limited number of lockout champions in the game, there's also a fair limited amount of cooldown refresh or just lockout prevention champions that exist as well. So combining your teams with one of these can provide a very good way of counteracting the effects of lockout. Now, the next one is just bringing like the do not care champions, I'm going to call them. These are champions that just are not super affected by increased cooldown effects. And top of the mind comes to just most mythical damage dealing champions. So classic example are champions like Embrius or Nice, where Embrius, if we go into Embrius, he is a whatchamacallit, he's a Knight Revenant, right? So if you look at Embrius, his form 1 is just more about the utility, and then his form 2 is his HP nuker base form. And like most other mythicals, if you are locked out in your first form, your second form abilities aren't locked out, so you can then transform into your second form and you still have access to all of your damage dealing abilities. So lockout against Embrius, assuming he is built and meant to be used as a damage dealer, isn't actually affected by lockout. Of course, if he's built slow and his stone's gonna get stripped, that's still a problem, but at least his utility as a nuker when he gets his turn isn't affected by lockout. Nice is quite similar in the aspect where it's really his form 2 that is the more annoying part, brings in a lot of the utility, and that's the form you really want to lock out. But of course, when he comes in, in his form 1, even if he is locked out, yeah, you can't place a block revive, but it's really the form 2 that matters. So a lot of mythical champions like Nice, like Embrius, don't really care about being locked out. I think there are another vein of champions that aren't mythicals, but have the ability to cycle extra turns. So the classic example you guys can think of is Rhodos, right? He has the ability to gain extra turns on his A1. And of course, when you pair him with like a 9-piece Merciless set, that bumps up to about 40%. So even if he is locked out, right, his cooldowns are, you know, on a 3-turn and on a 2-turn. So if he gets 2 extra turns, he can then go into his A2, or if he gets 3 extra turns, he can go into his A3 as well, right? So even if someone like Rhodos is locked out, his ability to chain extra turns can get him back to his cooldowns without needing anyone to have a cooldown refresh ability. And then even another option within the Undead Horde is Sanguine Maria. She has an even better chance of getting extra turns on her A1, which is even better than Rhodos, of course. And then, you know, her A3 is on a 3-turn cooldown. So if you take 2 extra turns, you can chain into the A3, and then it's your 3rd turn, and then you counteract and lock out your opponent, right? It's actually a fairly interesting option in today's meta if you do have her. Again, I showcased her on Friday. So you guys do have her and she does get locked out. You don't necessarily need to bring in somebody to refresh her cooldowns because she's likely using her A1 anyways to kind of start off a fight. So I think there are veins of non-mythical champions such as these two, and there's probably others that I'm not really thinking of that can cycle extra turns to get back to their cooldowns. And then finally, the third vein is just champions that have super strong passive effects that where even if they are locked out, they aren't out of the fight just yet. And of course, champions like Volcanos kind of come into mind, where if you think about what Volcanos really does, it's really the damage coming from his HP burns and activating his HP burns, and that's where a lot of his damage comes from. Of course, he still hits extremely hard as a champion, but even if he is locked out, he still has a lot of damage potential. And of course, another champion such as Nell kind of falls in the same boat, where a lot of her power level is in her passive to place poisons. And so even if she is locked out, yeah, she can't activate the poisons herself. But the fact that she is placing out poisons is the main sort of bulk of where her damage is coming from. And so that kind of wraps up this section of, but just being able to bring in champions that kind of don't care about being locked out, whether it is they can morph into their second form, whether it is they're chaining turns, or whether they have like really strong passives. Another example, you know, just for the strong passives, somebody like a Hefrak, for example, right, where you can use his A3 ability whenever an ally dies because it's locked to his passive, it can't be locked out. Another similar champion to that is like Anorn, for example, right? The dwarf, the void dwarf, wherever the dwarves are. We have Anorn, who can also activate his Wrath of the Hrothgleim on his A3 whenever he receives fatal damage, right? And then I think the classic example that we can all think of is Leonardo, where if he is run on a 4-turtle team, he still has access to his passive, or rather his A3 passive, which activates the skill whenever an ally HP drops below 50%, right? So there are champions that have super strong passives that kind of supplement the fact that even if they are locked out, the passives still get to go. Now, of course, regardless of the champions, if you are thinking about some of the support champions, you still have the ability to either run them in something like a 4-piece Relentless set, or just having impulse sets or reflex sets or whatever it might be. I think reflex is probably a little bit not geared towards PvP, but having the ability to have Relentless sets as well as impulse sets to refresh your cooldowns a little bit faster and helps you to cycle through to some of your more supportive skills. Now, the third option here is where we start getting you start getting a little bit worse down the line, which is just having like a high res / tanky support. And this is more so of just a stall strategy. You want to have someone who can help keep your team alive, built either with high resistance, or maybe you have a chronophage on it or whatever. But the idea is to have this one champion, usually a support champion or something like that, be able to resist the lockout, keep your team alive, and kind of stall until your team is, you know, has their cooldowns back. So, for example, something like Lady Noelle plus a Sir Nick. In the past, I used to, or I still do, but I just don't use her as much now because I think her build is bad. But I did have Lady Noelle in a very high resistance build. She had about 858 resistance. And my main goal was to use her as a very tanky resistance champ. She has a 6-piece stone skin on. And even if my whole team gets wiped and locked out, she's able to resist the lockout, and then she can place an AoE freeze. And that helps me to cycle back to my turns, my ally turns, and to try to get to my turn after I get my cooldowns back, right? If you do pair her with Sir Nick, you can, and Sir Nick gets locked out, you can still use Lady Noelle's ability, give your whole team unkillable, and that helps you to stall things through. I think some other champions that can kind of fit this bill, you know, like Helicath, for example. I've seen some really tanky Helicath builds with either super high resistance or just chronophage, and that allows Helicath to place block damage on all your allies, so it kind of stall things out. Someone like Odin kind of falls into the same boat, right? Where after 8 turns, he's able to place block damage on all your allies, and that's tied to his passive. So even if he is locked out, it doesn't have any effect to his passive, right? You can also bring in champion, you know, like Corrosa kind of falls in the same boat, being able to place unkillable on everybody. Even someone like Necrit, just having someone super tanky as well, where, okay, you, even though your damage dealer gets locked out, Necrit keeps them alive for 2 turns, and that allows them to get back to their damage dealing abilities. But yeah, either just having a super tanky support options that are able to provide protected buffs, and benefit if you can actually build a high enough resistance to resist some of the lockout. I think resistance is fairly hard to build, but it's a little bit like catering. Is it easier now? Is it harder now? Of course, because Krixia is a mythical champion and she does have that ignore resistance on her ability. It's very difficult to build enough resistance against Krixia in particular. But, you know, Fabian is a legendary champion, doesn't really have it, right? I think also very interesting right now is that most people are sacrificing some accuracy for speed and trying to pump up their Fabians, their Crixias to be the fastest champions on their teams, just given how the meta is shifting out. And so the overall accuracy that you are going to be seeing on these champions, I think, are currently going to be lower than they might have been, you know, a year ago, for example. And so I think it is actually a little bit easier to build resistance. I think 850 right now might be a little bit even high. Like I could probably sacrifice at least 50, maybe 100 if that might be pushing it. But, you know, I can sacrifice a little bit of resistance to build a little bit more speed. I think somewhere around 800 resistance is probably actually fairly good in terms of being able to resist lockout, just because lockout champions have been trading speed or accuracy for speed. And then finally, I think, is the sort of assassination attempt, the try to kill the lockout champion before they're able to do their lockout. Commonly, you can picture champions like Calvalax or Hegemon, the kind of 2 classic examples that have been in the meta for, you know, the before Mercurial, of course, for the past, you know, year or so. Now, because of Mercurial, I think there is a big fall off of these champions. Calvalax, of course, is definitely weaker in general because of things like Feral sets, because of Stone Skin, which you might still be seeing Fabians and Crixias being run in. And so Calvalax is just a super inconsistent option. Hegemon, of course, can bust through Stone Skins and, you know, place the block active skills on top of that. So it is more consistent, but doesn't do anything against Mercurial, for example. And then both Calvalax and Hegemon are just kind of useless champions after they do their thing on the very first turn or at the start of the game. My personal favorite for this strategy, if you do want to employ it, is actually Alo. I did put out a showcase video for you guys in showing how you can pump up Alo to go first on any team, you know, reaching like 450 speed, 500 speed. It's totally possible with Alo, and he is able to take out either the Crixias or the Fabians. And then he is still a competent damage dealer, right? So me particularly, I think Alo is the most consistent as well as the best option. Of course, we have 2 void legendaries on this list. But that's not to say Alo isn't weak to Mercurial either, right? He gets very countered by Mercurial. And really, why this method is so bad is it's completely feast or famine, right? If you are running Hegemon or Calvalax and they don't end up killing their respective target, maybe because of Stone Skin, maybe because of Feral, whatever it might be, you kind of lose on the spot, right? Because you've brought in a useless champion who didn't do anything, and then your team still gets locked out. And so this is definitely getting worse and worse the more Mercurial there is. I'm imagining a future where all Crixias have 9-piece Mercurial because it just makes total sense. And these strategies just aren't going to work. And so employ these carefully. These are definitely probably more possible in live arena, where there might be a wider span of targets. Maybe it's, like Arbiter, Fabian, Classic, Double Duo that probably doesn't have Stone Skin. If you want to bring in a Hegemon, that's probably decent, right? But just be careful. It's a super feast or famine strategy. And right now the champion options are fairly poor in terms of actually having good champions to actually bring in. Like Calvlax, Hegemon, of course, they're strong for the one thing they do, but super countable, right? Alo, great into Stone Skin, actually, he has an ability that can actually go through Stone Skin, right? He has the A2. Let me just pull up my own Alo right here. He has the A2, which can ignore Stone Skin, hits fairly hard, ignores defense, and then, the turn meter fill on his passive, right? So I think Alo is actually the best option if you guys do have him to employ. And if you guys want to just see what I did, I have a video on my channel for that as well. Finally, let's talk about the last one. And this is just simply having a super fast team that goes first. When you have a super fast speed booster, all of your champions go first, and then you don't really care about lockout champions because you've either just annihilated them because they're generally squishier built champions, or you've won the game and you've killed enough units and you've kind of done your thing, right? Now, I think this is actually a very good strategy, right? I think this is probably the sure most fire way of beating lockout champions, apart from just simply having a faster lockout champion, right? And if you have somebody that can boost your team super fast and make sure everyone goes before the lockout champion, you don't even need a lockout champion of your own if you do have the better champions to do it, right? Maybe you can bring in like an Odin, or for example, or you bring in like a Sanguine Maria, right? So you bring in extra damage dealers like a Geralt or something, right? You have abilities that CC, whether it be, Stormcaller Marius, right? You have some super strong strategies that kind of go first, but you do have to be careful because you kind of need another support champion in there that gives you that survivability if you don't kill everyone on your go first turn, right? Champions like Odin with passives that give block damage, or champions like Neve that kind of give you that extra support, or even, something like Donatello might be fine as well, right? But the idea of this is it's super good. You do need some very specific champions, I would say. You need to have champions that speed boost at least, 30%, I think is the target. And you want to make sure, you have a fast speed ore, you have a 6-star intimidating presence. Everyone else is on your team is built fast, not only just fast, but also speed tuned so that they're going one after the other. And if I'm being honest, this is actually a fairly good strategy. You might see the occasional one kind of floating around in high arena, like the Shuzen, for example. Of course, this goes Shuzen into Fabian. You can still do that as well, but I've seen teams. Let's see if anyone's beaten me with a similar strategy. Maybe not that I can tell, but just Shuzen into something, and then you have like Marius or something else, right? But you need to have nukers that do multi-hits. You need to have speed boosters that ideally boost more than 30% turn meter, or be able to reduce enemy turn meter, but that's less effective because of Stone Skin and Mercurial. You need to have some support champions that are able to protect your champions if you don't win after you go first turn. And you have to have a strong sort of understanding of your opponent's team comp, right? If they just have someone like, I don't know, nice Sig friend, yada yada, right, who even after you kind of obliterate everyone, they survive, they go and they kind of get to nuke down your board, right? Or even like an Anorn, right? For example, that's another good example, who will just survive any lethal damage and then wipe out your team. So you have to be a little bit careful. You have to have a good understanding of your opponent's champions, and you have to have a very specific sort of setup on your own, right? You have to be able to deal with Mercurial, you have to be able to deal with Stone Skin, you have to be able to deal with champions with ridiculously strong passives, and it comes down to understanding, having the right gear, team comp, whatever it might be. But I think it's still very potent and powerful, but you just have to be careful, and that's really all it is. So those are going to be my personal 5 strategies for dealing with lockout champions. I do want to highlight Donatello as the closing off for just showing again what he is doing and why he is so powerful. So not only does Donatello come in and bring his his cooldown refresh on the Shell Shocker. He also has the cleanse and the full heal, right? So just a very versatile kit where he can do so many things. He can protect one of your allies from dying with I got you bro passive whenever an ally is about to be hit with a fatal hit. This champion prevents this ally's death and keeps them alive with 1 HP, then equalizes the ally's HP, blah blah blah, right? So very powerful in being able to just keep somebody alive, heal them up, and kind of mitigate the whole effect, right? This is really powerful if you ever seen like a Siegfried uses A3 and then Donatello's like, I got you, bro, and completely stops that damage, prevents Siegfried from splashing damage onto everyone else, right? He brings in a turn meter boost with that full cleanse, continuous heal, strengthen, one of the best buffs to reduce damage that isn't something like unkillable or block damage. And he has what I would call a fairly decent heal. He actually can spam out a lot of heals, especially when paired with, the counterattack masteries or even with another turtle like Leonardo, right? I actually see a good amount of him paired around in the arena. One of the common combos I've actually seen is Fabian plus Donatello. And this is kind of like a two-way insurance where one, if you are fast with your Fabian, you just simply lock them out and that's dandy. But if you aren't fast with your Fabian, you still have Donatello to kind of come in and give you that cooldown refresh. I think the other thing that's super potent about this combination is Krixia, for example, right? A lot of times people are going to bring in Krixia to counteract Fabians. Even if Fabian is faster than Krixia, Krixia goes into her form 2 and brings the Night Purge, right? Which refreshes the cooldown of all ally skills. But what's cool about the Donatello plus Fabian combo is Fabian goes first, he locks out all champions. Krixia then refreshes the cooldown of all champions. Donatello goes, refreshes the cooldown of Fabian, and then if you can see where I'm going with this, Fabian then increases the cooldowns again, and the Krixia no longer has a way of resetting the cooldowns, right? So this is actually a fairly awesome pairing that I have seen in Platinum Arena and can be super hard to deal with, because Donatello, again, can be built in multiple ways to counteract it. I don't have a good build for it, for example, but he can be built with a lot of resistance where he can resist cooldown increasing effects. He is magic affinity, which means he can be weak hit by Krixia and Fabian, or he can have a chronophage set, and that can help to prevent the need for building super high resistance, right? So a super flexible champion in the way he can be geared either with chronophage or high resistance, has the ability to get weak hit, which throws everything out the window, and brings in so much utility and survivability to your team, not only giving the resets, but also to kind of double down on cooldown increase abilities as well. And so Donatello, I think, is a super awesome champion. I have him on my wish list. I only have a 3-star soul. I wish I went harder for that 5-star soul, because that would help me to open up some higher resistance builds and not rely on having a really shitty set of chronophage, because I, like probably many of you, probably were told to, you can probably ignore farming for chronophage. But chronophage, I think, is fairly prevalent, especially on champions like Donatello. I have seen it floating around on other people. Again, you do have to be careful if you are facing against Krixia. Chronophage can be removed before the lockout happens. And so if I did have chronophage, I would have to switch this blessing over from cruelty to lightning cage. So again, that's something you want to make sure you guys are checking out. Before I let you guys go, one last thing I want to touch up on this week, and that is, of course, a Bayek. Now, Bayek has been out for a while, of course, given that we came out with the Assassins, but recently I think that we've finally seen enough summoning events where players have had the opportunity to acquire Bayek, either through like the Prism event we had last week. There are the 2x voids with the 10x on Bayek. We've had like 2 of those in the past month or so. And I think finally looking at Arena, especially at the high ends, you definitely see a lot more Bayek in terms of defenses, for example. This refresh somehow only has 1, but if we refresh again, how many can we see? And just 1. Okay, well, poor example. Let's see like the plat defenses, because I swear there is definitely a lot more Bayek than it kind of shows. But let's just see. So we have 1 Bayek here. One Bayek here, one Bayek here, and one Bayek here. Oh, okay, that is definitely less than I thought. But Solinar, of course, definitely much more represented. But either way, I just wanted to talk about Bayek because I have personally been seeing more of him, and I'm sure you guys have also been seeing more of him. I think generally he is quite annoying. I will just review exactly what he does for anyone unfamiliar, so you guys are at least equipped when you guys see him either in live arena or classic arena. Where does he go? But the main thing that he really does here is his passive. And so he is a very powerful support champion who has ability to prevent your champions from critting, as long as whoever you're attacking has higher accuracy than whatever champion you have on your team. What also makes this really powerful is the fact that he can also place increased accuracy on all allies, in addition to increased defense and perfect veil. So it can be very annoying to deal with your opponent's team if they have Bayek. Now, I will insert my own hot take here, and the fact that I think all the content creators I have seen have mostly been proponents for building Bayek as a damage dealer. So they have been building him, fairly similar to how you might approach someone like Marius, for example, right? High defense, high crit, savage lethal, stone skin kind of thing with moderate accuracy. Maybe like I've seen like 400, 500, nothing more than that really. And for me personally, I think that has been, I don't think that that is the right approach to take. I think it's much better to build a Bayek as a support champion with high base, with high health, defense, speed, and as much accuracy as you can. Something more like a Krixia, for example, except obviously Krixia builds resistance instead of accuracy. So the big thing is that I think Bayek hasn't, in terms of defenses and where Bayek kind of fits in terms of what kind of roles there are. Yes, he can deal some amount of damage, but I think that within the meta right now, there's really not a lack of damage dealers, and it's really all about the support champions you kind of run with, right? Um, uh, Most of these teams, for example, you see here, there's only Marius as a damage dealer, Solnar is the main damage dealer. Some of them, yeah, some of them have two damage dealers, but really, I think there's a heavy emphasis on the meta in terms of, yes, you can have one damage dealer, or that is solely focused on damage. Someone like Nice, for example, yes, he's a damage dealer, but he's also just way more than just that. And I think that building damage on Bayek and sacrificing things like accuracy, sacrificing things like survivability can be fairly detrimental. In addition, I'll just say one more point about the meta itself. Let's see if we can find something. But I think there's nothing really groundbreaking or meta breaking in terms of Bayek being introduced. I think he kind of falls into the same boat as champions like Neve or Necrit or just other sort of tanky support champions that just help your team survive. Granted, he is better at dealing with certain champions than others, but at least in terms of classic arena, it's easy to kind of go in, okay, they have Bayek, I understand I need to bring in somebody with accuracy. Whether that be whether that be someone like Marius, whether that be someone like Carnage, whether that be just whatever damage dealer you have that is able to build accuracy. And so in classic arena, when you know you're fighting against Bayek, you're just going to have to change your lineup a little bit, but focus on making sure that you do have someone that has high enough accuracy in order to deal with them. I think Bayek serves a much better purpose in the live arena, for example, where, there's a whole complex draft thing. You can kind of bring him last. And this can really disrupt the sort of opponent's game plan when it comes to things like draft. But in terms of classic arena, in terms of siege, I really see a very, very minimal level of impact because these are very premeditated game modes where you can build teams centered around what you are facing. And I think there's nothing really super unique about Bayek, right? He's not like preventing something like, he's not like preventing block revive from happening. He's not like preventing units from being able to hit through block damage, for example, right? All he is doing is just mitigating damage. And there's tons of champions out there who have similar effects, right? We have Neve, who's really good at mitigating damage. We have Necker, who's really good at mitigating damage. Even just like ally protection in general is good at mitigating damage. I don't know if I have too many champions in my roster to kind of showcase that. But if we look at like the arena, right? Who's good at mitigating damage out here? Even champions like Theodosia, I believe, have just damage mitigation passives in their kit of Theodosia, where allies just take less damage, right? So there's a ton of damage mitigation within the meta, and so there's really not that much that Bayek is bringing differently to the table, apart from just making it better against very specific champions. If you guys want me to cover team compositions, Bayek, how to beat him a little bit more in detail, I can definitely do that in the future, but for now, I'll just leave it at that. But that's going to wrap up things over here for you guys. This week, I wanted to cover some strategies to help you guys deal with some of the cooldown effects in the meta that I think are super prevalent. If you guys have some of your own strategies that you've developed that are working for you guys when it comes to dealing with champions like Krixia and Fabian, I love to hear them. So feel free to let me know down below in the comments. If you guys found this video helpful, I'd be glad to hear some of the feedback or comments from you guys as well. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you guys enjoyed another Sunday of meta, whatever I want to call this little thing. But hope you guys have a fantastic day. Hope you guys have a great weekend as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video, okay? Love you guys. Peace out.